Before Europe had kings, before empires rose and fell, before history had names for rulers, Europe was already fighting. Not for thrones, not for dynasties, not for ideology, but for something far older and far more dangerous. Control. Control of metal. Control of land. Control of the routes that decided who prospered and who vanished. Long before crowns symbolized authority, power was already being fought over and won. Welcome to Mr. M Historian, where wealth, strategy, and leadership reveal the real story behind Europe's past. Here, we don't begin with kings. We begin with what created them. Because Europe's first rulers were not born into power. They rose from conflict over resources. This is the story of how Europe's earliest wars shaped its first leaders, and how those leaders became kings. 4,000 years ago, Europe looked nothing like it does today. There were no borders, no capitals, no written laws. Instead, the continent was divided into hundreds of small communities, tribes bound together by kinship, survival, and memory. Most people lived close to rivers, fertile plains, coastlines. Land was not owned in the modern sense. It was defended, shared, and remembered. Leadership was temporary. Authority depended on usefulness. And that fragile balance was about to be shattered. For early European communities, survival depended on access. Access to food-producing land. Access to fresh water. Access to materials that made tools and weapons. Stone tools had limits. Wood rotted. Bone broke. Then metallurgy changed everything. Metal did not just improve daily life. It redefined power. Around 2300 BCE, bronze transformed Europe. Bronze axes cut deeper. Bronze spears killed faster. Bronze swords decided battles. But bronze came at a cost. It required two separate metals: copper, tin. And these metals were rare. Copper deposits were scattered across the Alps, the Balkans, and Iberia. Tin was even harder to find, limited to a few distant regions. No single community possessed both. Trade was no longer optional. It became the foundation of survival. Trade routes spread across Europe like veins. Rivers carried metal and goods inland. Coastal routes connected distant cultures. Mountain passes became economic choke points. Settlements positioned along these routes prospered. They accumulated surplus food, exotic goods, weapons, influence. Wealth began to concentrate, and concentration of wealth always attracts violence. As prosperity grew, so did danger. Archaeology reveals a sudden shift. Villages surrounded by palisades, ditches dug for defense, hilltops converted into strongholds. This was not fear. It was strategy. Communities were preparing for conflict because competition for trade routes was intensifying. The age of organized violence had begun. These conflicts were not chaotic brawls. They followed patterns. Groups formed coalitions. Raids became coordinated. Targets were chosen strategically. Evidence tells a brutal story. Skeletons bearing weapon wounds. Settlements destroyed and abandoned. Mass graves without ceremony. These were Europe's earliest wars, and they changed society forever. War demands leadership. Someone had to organize fighters, decide strategy, protect supply lines, negotiate alliances. Those who succeeded gained followers. Those who failed were forgotten. Authority became tied to competence. For the first time, power extended beyond kinship. Leadership became influence. Over generations, successful leaders accumulated more than loyalty. They controlled metal production, long-distance trade, armed retainers. Wealth was redistributed to secure allegiance. Social hierarchy deepened. A new elite emerged, distinct from ordinary warriors. Their status was visible in life and unmistakable in death. At some point, leadership stopped being earned each generation. Influence began to pass from father to son. Control of trade routes became permanent. Military force became organized. Symbols of authority became standardized. Crowns had not yet appeared, but kingship had begun. By around 1200 BCE, parts of Europe had crossed the threshold. Power was now recognized, inherited, defended. These early kingdoms were not vast empires. They were networks of loyalty, trade, and force. Their strength came from understanding one truth. You don't need to conquer everything if you control what everyone depends on. Europe's first wars were never about crowns. Crowns were the result, not the cause. The real struggle was always about resources, influence, and control. From bronze trade routes to modern supply chains, from tribal alliances to global diplomacy, the logic of power has never changed. This is how Europe's first kings were made. If history matters to you, subscribe and like. More forgotten chapters of power, war, and strategy are coming.